Welcome to workshop number 6. Today, Grant Manager's Workshop for the Office of Insular Affairs. Today, we'll be discussing NEPA 101, categorical exclusions. It'll be presented by Rhonda Lucas of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. The Office of Insular Affairs contracts the U.S. Army USACE, Honolulu office, to conduct this, to do NEPA review for us, for our grants. Quick reminders before we start today. We've been informed that decisions for TAP, MAP, EIC, CRNR for 2026, which we had originally told you would be around September, leadership has decided to push the decision and the award announcements of those grants to October. So a little bit more patience, a little bit more time, and hopefully October will stick and we'll get information out to you whether grants have been awarded or rejected. Another, maybe just a quick heads up about today's meeting is we did a similar NEPA 101 workshop in American Samoa last week. And we had a recording done, but we have some we're still trying to get it posted onto our website. So that will take probably another few more days before we get it up onto our website. But just wanted you to have that awareness that we are working hard to get that up and running so that you can click on the links and watch more of NEPA 101 anytime. I'm sure Rhonda will address that, but just wanted to double confirm to you that we are working on getting that together. So if there aren't any questions, Christina, if I haven't forgotten anything, any reminders from your desk before we turn it over to Rhonda?
One last reminder is that with the end of fiscal year coming up, please keep in mind to get your drawdowns in. Our systems will shut down about I believe it's either September 15th or September 23rd. I don't recall off the top of my head, but I'll find it before this is over. So we won't be able to process drawdowns after that point until the systems open back up. And also, if your grant ends September 30th, just be aware because final reports and final drawdowns will occur after that. So it's a little bit of off the normal cycle of reporting. So just a reminder. Thanks.
That's an excellent reminder. And without further ado, Rhonda, how about I turn the show over to you? Oops, I jumped too far ahead.
Oh.
And I will stop sharing.
Thank you. Yeah, and it's telling me right now only meeting presenters and organizers can share. So I'm not sure quite how to share my screen.
One moment, Rhonda. I think we can add you as a presenter.
Okay. Okay.
All right, you should be able to share now.
Yeah, let me grab this. All right. Please give me a thumbs up if you can see that screen. Okay, good. Looks like Tanya can see it. So I'm going to go ahead and start. So as Tanya mentioned, we recently did a NEPA 101 presentation, and that will suddenly be available probably in about a week on the OIA website. So today, in the interest of time, I'm just presenting a general overview of the NEPA review process specific for OIA grants with a big focus on categorical exclusions. So today I'll talk about what is circled in red. So just for reference, on the 18th of this month, we did this NEPA 101 training, and we discussed all of these topics in detail. So when that's available for review, you're able to go back in, and if you have any questions, we may suggest reviewing that for everything you need. So again, today I'm just going to discuss what's in the red circle. So I'll talk about where to find the NEPA regulations and implementing procedures that are in use today. I will briefly summarize the overall NEPA review process and then focus on categorical exclusions, since this is the level of NEPA analysis applicable to most OIA grantees and grants. And I will explain the need to examine potential extraordinary circumstances to apply a CATEX to your project. So the discussion today applies to the federal territories that are subject to NEPA statute. But if you are in the FSM or Marshall Islands, your nation may have their own similar environmental regulations. So it may still be helpful to follow along. As mentioned, NEPA has changed a lot in the last few years. It was largely left unchanged for about 40 years. However, in the last 6 years, there have been substantial changes, not only in the statute itself, but on how NEPA is implemented across the federal government. This is due to executive orders, congressional amendments, and court rulings. But regardless, NEPA requires agencies take a hard look at potential environmental impacts. So this includes reviewing natural and human environmental resources for potentially significant effects that result from a proposed grant action. When looking at NEPA, we also look at compliance with other environmental laws, such as Endangered Species Act and waters laws. So OIA, as Tanya mentioned, OIA has engaged USACE to complete an independent evaluation of potential environmental effects, verify the NEPA compliance, and provide a recommendation to OIA. So at the Army Corps of Engineers, we also help with federal consultations, such as Section 7 of the ESA and Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. And we always document those findings and produce some sort of a document that we share with OIA with our recommendations. As grantees, the reason you care about this and need to do this is because federal dollars are what trigger the NEPA requirement. So because your grants are using federal funds and all the action is considered a federal action and therefore subject to NEPA review. So USACE helps with this NEPA review process. But also based on the grant terms and conditions that you get when you receive a grant, it mentions that the grantee is responsible for preparation of NEPA documentation. And I bring this up to empower you as grantees, because the more complete and more detailed your project narratives, the faster we can work through the NEPA process. So in an ideal world, all the information we need is in your NEPA project description. So it has the 5 W's, the who, what, where, why, when, and how. And then if clarification is needed, USACE may reach out and ask questions. So ultimately, our goal is get to the authorization to proceed stage, or the ATP. So we work closely with you and OIA to get there. So USACE does not speak for OIA or issue ATPs, but it's important to note that a project cannot proceed and funds cannot be spent until NEPA is complete and that ATP is issued by OIA. So as I mentioned, NEPA requires OIA as the lead agency to assess all components of the proposed project before the project can begin and funding can start re-released. So NEPA, if you think about it, it's like a summary book report that covers many chapters or resources. So we review these for potential significance. So sometimes people refer to NEPA as an umbrella law because when we're conducting the NEPA process, we review and integrate the compliance requirements with other federal laws, like the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, and many others. But we cannot assess the details we don't know. So if you have not yet planned your project, OIA can't approve what they can't yet evaluate. So for instance, if you have a future build action, so you're doing a design bid build project, in this case, talk with your OIA grant manager, because maybe you can phase a project so that the first step would be planning and design and NEPA requirements, and then the second phase down the line would be a future implementation. So the triangle on the left of the screen shows the NEPA evaluation and documentation in descending orders of complexity, from significant to least significant. And so I just want to share this slide to talk about some terminology. So the good news is most OIA grants fall at the bottom of this pyramid. So the least complex, but I'm going to start at the top and just let you know. So in NEPA, there's 3 levels of analysis, and the most complex is an environmental impact statement. That is documented with what we call a record of decision that is signed by the federal agencies. And an EIS is done when there is a significant impact to environments. We know something is going to be impacted. These might be for huge projects, developments, or seaports. Maybe we know we're working with endangered species and we can't mitigate impacts. So, but in most cases we avoid EISs. I think there's only 1 or 2 that have been done with any OIA grants. So really minimal occurrence with OIA. The second level down is an environmental assessment, and that is documented with what we call a finding of no significant impacts, or a FONSI. Again, not frequently used, but you might use them if an action either doesn't fit into a categorical exclusion or you aren't sure whether it might be significant. But again, these are long and complex documents that we generally try to avoid if possible. So that leaves us down with a categorical exclusion, which is documented with a memorandum of 2 types, either a REC or an MTF. Now, a CATEX does not mean that NEPA isn't required. A categorical exclusion simply means that a group of similar routine actions that have already been analyzed by the agency and determined to not have significant effects under NEPA. And a REC may include coordination with local agencies. So the REC is the more complex of the 2, a record of environmental consideration. This might be required when we need to coordinate under Section 106 for cultural resources, or there's work in waters or wetlands. Maybe you're deploying buoys and you need permits. So there's often conditions required by another federal agency. But RECs are still fairly simple, provided we have all the information we need, and they can usually be completed in weeks to maybe months. And then the simplest of all is the memorandum to file. So this is where a CATEX applies, and there's no other compliance required. And these are very fast, and they might be completed by OIA without USACE review at all. So as I mentioned, NEPA has changed a lot, and now more than ever, it's really important to know what agency you are using as your lead agency, because each agency has their own NEPA procedures. For OIA grants, OIA is a bureau within the Department of Interior, so they follow Department of Interior regulations. In February, just 6 months ago, DOI published their final rule. So this is still fairly new, and hence why there has been a lot of changes in the last few years. And the final procedures and regulations have 2 components. So first of all is the implementing regulations, and these are the actual rules and regulations, the law. And then the second part is the NEPA handbook of implementing procedures, and this explains the process. This is the how the process is completed. So they work in concert with each other. And so the way you're going to find them, and again, this PowerPoint will be available to you. So you're going to go to this link at the bottom and click on that link. That will take you to the Department of Interior's NEPA page, but you can also Google DOI NEPA, and it's usually the first thing to pop up. So when I click on this link, this is where it takes me. In the blue hypertext, you'll find the final rule and the DOI handbook, as well as some other publications and news releases. This red box shows the resources important to today's discussion. So the first link is the DOI final rule. This is the Federal Register page showing the actual regulation. And once you click on it, it takes you to the Federal Register PDF. And what I'm showing here are just excerpts from the PDF. The total document is about 25 pages, and it's been streamlined. So there are less regulations than Department of Interior previously had. But what's included in these regulations remain things like emergency responses, procedures for using contractors, how to select lead agencies, because in some case, more than one federal agency is funding a project, so there's a process to determine which is the lead agency for NEPA. And then important for us today is it retains 12 universal categorical exclusions, or CATEXs. And these are generally routine administrative actions. These cover small purchases, travel, training, maybe survey and mapping or planning studies, and contracting for A&E designs. So these tend to be CATEXs with no or minimal ground disturbance, or they might be things like repainting a structure that is routinely done with minimal effects. So the good news is many of the projects at OIA immediately fit within one of these CATEXs, and if it does, without any other extraordinary circumstances, this is an easy MTF that we can turn around very quickly. And it's done either by us or by OIA. The other thing that applies is the extraordinary circumstances, and you'll see these notations like 46.215. Those refer to the sections in the law that discuss these. And so extraordinary circumstances need to be reviewed before any CATEX applies. So I would suggest downloading, if you're really interested in a deep dive in this area, I would suggest downloading the PDF and maybe highlighting the sections of importance. Going back out to the DOI NEPA page, if we click on this second link below, we're going to get to the handbook. So this is the Department of Interior's Handbook of NEPA Environmental Policy Implementing Procedures. This is the latest and current edition, published in February 2026. The entire handbook is about 130 pages, so I would suggest downloading it electronically, and then you can just search it as a PDF. But you can also search it live on the website. So here I'm just showing a table of contents for simplicity. And the chapters on the left, these deal with Department of Interior agency planning and integration with NEPA. So it just kind of explains how Department of Interior approaches NEPA. On the right hand at the top is Appendix A, and Appendix A provides further guidance on how to do the actual NEPA. So if you are a go-getter and want to start really diving into this yourself, I suggest looking at Appendix 1 and look at Part 2. So that's where it says categorical exclusion and extraordinary circumstances. And this is really what I'm briefly summarizing here today. So a note on terminology, DOI uses the abbreviation CE for categorical exclusion. In my presentation, I've written it out as CATEX for clarity. And these are the same things. We are just federal agencies, so we really like to use alphabet soup. But when you come across those terms, CATEX and CE are the same. So then at the bottom of this page, you'll notice Appendix 2, and that is really the meat of where you want to be. That has about 200 CATEXs available for use across the bureaus. And here I've just extracted a page from Appendix 2. Most DOI CATEXs relate to land management because a lot of the Department of Interior bureaus do land management activities. But in general, Appendix 2 gives you an idea of which minor and routine actions have been identified. So minor and routine tends to be an important word. So these are, again, things that have been done over and over again and determined not to be significant. But again, 90% of all OIA grant projects will fall into one of these categories, one of these 200 categories. So if the project does not have a physical component or otherwise affect the environment, no veg removal, no ground disturbance, it's likely eligible for a CATEX. And that really puts us at the bottom of that pyramid in that REC and MTF category. If there is ground disturbance or in-water work, if you need to remove trees, USACE might need additional details. For instance, if you're trenching, we may ask you, how much ground disturbance there is, or putting in utility lines. So ideally, all that information is in your grant application. So when we're looking for CATEXs, we need to look at the whole action with all the components. So including things like planning and staging areas. So for instance, if there's geotech investigations associated with your project, that's a component that needs to be included. Now, sometimes grantees write grants where there's separate sub-projects. So one action might be for training and another one might be for a procurement of a separate piece of equipment. And those separate sub-components with independent utility, it would make sense that they would use separate CATEXs. So really when we look at it, there might be one grant, but it funds separate activities. But in some cases, an action is more complex and might require multiple CATEXs. In that case, it's a case-by-case basis, but the agency permits multiple CATEXs, but may require things to route through the Department of Interior's Office of the Solicitor for coordination prior to using multiple CATEXs. And we have to document this reliance. So regardless, we are hoping when you apply for a grant, whether you have multiple sub-projects with independent utility, make that really clear in your proposal, and that will help this process. Other categorical exclusions frequently may require additional interagency coordination, again, especially if there's ground disturbance, or it might require a local land use permit. Those you would handle potentially on a case-by-case basis, but you could do that independently and concurrently with the NEPA review process. So if an action is covered by a categorical exclusion, you must then assess for the next step would be assessing for any extraordinary circumstances. So I'm going to slow down for a minute and give you guys an example project that we can kind of work through together. So this would be a typical project that we might receive. It's a fictional project, but something similar to what we get. So we're going to say it's an interior restroom renovation at a community park. And I'm going to say that the grantee provided in their scope of work narrative a map, and that contractor plans are included. And this really is limited to a small structure where there's interior flooring replacement, maybe replacing some toilets and sinks and repainting, possibly replacing light fixtures. So my first step would be to ensure that the project description of all actions and phases is complete. And again, I'm assuming I have that in this case. And the questions I might ask, are, how extensive are the renovations? Or is there any ground disturbance outside the building or the structure? Or is there any exterior modification? Things like windows and roofing might come into play if the structure is more than 50 years old and a potentially historic structure where there could be impacts. So those are the kind of questions you might get back and forth from USACE, but you could also kind of preemptively add into your grant proposals. So if the action has a physical component and doesn't fall into one of the 12 Department of Interior universal CATEXs in the regulations, that first Federal Register notice I showed you, we look at Appendix 2 of the handbook. And scrolling through Appendix 2 of this handbook, let's say I've scrolled all the way to page 89. So the handbook is organized by bureaus. So National Park Service is a one section, and it's called section 12.5. And then on page 89, I find this page. And then I scroll down and I find that here in highlighted in red is a grant for replacement or renovation to facilities at their same location without altering the kind or amount of recreation, historic, or cultural resources of the area or the integrity of the existing setting. So that seems to fit. So I would see if the action does fit within that. I would tentatively classify this as a CATEX, and so it would be CATEX 12.5 F3. But then I need to move on to the next important step, which is I have to review the list of extraordinary circumstances from the regulations. So these are the from the first link that I showed you for the regulations in the Federal Register. There's the 9 categorical exclusions labeled A through, oh, sorry, no, the 9 extraordinary circumstances. These are extraordinary circumstances. They're labeled A through F. And these are going to tie into the other environmental laws and regulations covered under the NEPA review umbrella for our book report. So once we have a CATEX identified, we want to see if there's any situations that might kick us out of that CATEX. Because by law, actions cannot trigger an extraordinary circumstance when reviewed as a whole, and considering all the connected actions. So I'm going to actually walk through these extraordinary circumstances with you, because this is a critical part of what we do with our reviews. So the 9 critical criteria in the DOI regulations emphasize things like public health and safety. So is there health and safety concerns for both workers and the public? Would you be working with hazardous materials, or do you have personal protective equipment, PPE, or best management practices in place that relate to public health and safety? The next is natural cultural resources, wetlands, protected areas, and water supplies. So this ties into if your work is occurring in these areas, have you obtained your permits? And do you have any conditions you need to adhere to avoid these areas? C is novel approaches or unknown risks. So are you trying to do anything that is completely unknown or new, like a new procedure that's never been tested? D is establishing a precedent or representing a decision in principle. So in other words, if we approve this, does it mean every other project like this will get approved? Or is it a new, unique, novel thing? D, directly related to other potentially significant actions or segmentation. So E comes in when we look at a project we see as a part of a larger project overall. So in other words, is this one tiny component of a bigger significant action that is being piecemealed out to avoid the NEPA process? F reviews whether there are historic sites eligible for National Register listing. So this ties into buildings that are greater than 50 years old or a culturally important site. And in case where we might have these sites, it doesn't mean that we necessarily can't proceed, but we maybe needed to have done coordination with the SHPO. In those cases, we have that SHPO documentation to explain that we aren't having significant impacts on these resources. And same with ESA listed species or critical habitat. They can be there, but we have to have done our coordination with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA Fisheries and obtained our permits through our consultation process to demonstrate that we aren't having significant impacts to listed species or designated critical habitat. H, again, is that culturally important ceremonial sites. So there's several catches to make sure that we don't have significant impacts to those resources. And the last one, I, is something that catches a lot of people off guard. It's noxious weeds and invasive species. So in your project description, there needs to be a clear plan or best management practices that shows that your project won't contribute to the spread of non-native species. And it's not enough to just say, we won't spread weeds, but you need to have some sort of a weed management plan or identification of something that you're doing to avoid that. Oops, I'm sorry, let me go back one more time. And so the last thing is all of this needs to be documented in some way, shape, or form. So as I said, it needs to be justified. So documenting is kind of what USACE does, but it could also be documented through by OIA through an MTF, but it can also be documented with help from the grantee. So it doesn't matter who produces the NEPA document. USACE reviews it, but we don't necessarily need to be the one to draft it. So if a grantee wants to compile all the justification in a NEPA document, that is fine. We encourage you to go forward and do that, and it can actually help expedite the process. But regardless of who prepares a REC, the grantee is asked to sign the final REC so that you're acknowledging awareness of any agency conditions that might be needed prior to construction. So if you had to obtain permits, or even if it's a local land use permit and they say that you need to adhere to certain conditions or best management practices, your signature acknowledges that. So sometimes the documentation and back and forth with the grantee takes time. And again, this is where we encourage you to use your project description checklist that's provided by OIA grant managers and put all the details into your initial grant application. Because the sooner we get the complete information and background files, the faster we can draft the documentation. And so remember, NEPA doesn't say you can't have significant impacts, but if you want to use a CATEX for your project, you need to demonstrate that you will not have significant adverse effects on the resources that relate to these extraordinary circumstances. Following that, if the next step forward would be if there are no extraordinary circumstances, OIA would draft a recommendation for ATP and send that to OIA.
Rhonda, Rhonda.
Oh, yes.
Just a quick question. Can you go just back to the previous slide?
Absolutely.
This is a little bit for me, but maybe it'll be helpful to others too. So just to clarify, when we're doing NEPA, we're basically just providing the proof. We're having consultations with other federal partners if needed, or we're just demonstrating in our application that we have thought critically, we have given critical thought to whether or not there will be impact. And so that if somebody picks up our application and looks at it somewhere down the line, they will be confident and assured that we have considered all of these different impacts and maybe have included a best practice or ways to mitigate whatever the impact might be. It's not about stopping kind of a project, but just showing and demonstrating that we have given that thought. We have given thought to that, to the environment.
Exactly. And so now there is compliance. There are other federal laws and regulations, such as Endangered Species Act or Essential Fish Habitat or National Historic Preservation Act that do require interagency consultation. So these might require coordination with the SHPO or the services, especially if you're working in their jurisdiction. So to complete NEPA, we have to demonstrate that we've done that. But I'll go back one more slide just to show, and again, my notes, my 9 that I've listed there are my succinct summary of them. But if you want to read the actual extraordinary circumstances, they're listed in the Federal Register. So when we draft a rec, there is a table of extraordinary circumstances, and we not only go through and verify that table, but we have to include justification for our reasoning. So our justification might be that we've received a letter of concurrence from the SHPO that says there are no resources present, or we've communicated with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and we attach that email documentation to show what the services said in their own words. But that's a great question. And in cases where we have this, I wanted to do a very brief overview because there are cases where we are going to have extensive interagency coordination. And so those, if you have a project, again, that requires impacts historic resources or endangered species or has work in the water, we encourage you to talk very closely and early with your OIA grant manager and USACE, and we will all get together and kind of have these conversations about the best process forward to document it. Because again, yes, the goal is to get to ATP, so we're just finding efficient ways to move through that coordination and documentation process. So again, I'm going to kind of go then into this page what happens when no CATEX fits. So, right now we have many categorical exclusions. So the difficulty is often with very large or complex projects that don't fit within a CE. So it might be, constructing a new homestead is one of ours, for instance. Or if you were building a new airport, or these are huge, often multi-million or billion-dollar projects that have many significant impacts and moving parts. So those are likely not to fit within a CE. They also might not be something that OIA funds, but that's a separate conversation to have with your grant manager. So the difficulty now often arises from incomplete applications, or not an incomplete application, but an insufficient project description where we just don't have the level of details necessary to understand the potential impacts. Or there might be other regulatory issues, such as a project is just not authorized by EPA. So we had a case in one point where we wanted to, I think, burn oil, and it was going to off gas in a way that EPA didn't allow for air quality permits. So, there are still other environmental laws and regs we need to fit within. So if a proposed action implicates extraordinary circumstances, one thing we would do first is ask if the Bureau or the grantee can modify the action to eliminate the significance. So a grantee can always work with OIA grant manager to modify a scope of work proposal to reduce or avoid significant impacts. So sometimes the easiest thing is simply to change the location of a project, or maybe phase it separately. It also might just be taking out one component of a project that is potentially problematic. And again, we can go through longer processes, but to fit within a categorical exclusion, often the goal is to move quickly and easily through a project review process, so that you can receive ATP as a grantee and get funding. So sometimes by removing an element of the project, we can minimize that agency coordination or expedite it. Other times the process slows down because we might have an unknown location. So therefore, if we don't know where the location of a project is going to be situated, we're not able to proceed with NEPA review. So again, this ties into phasing, where maybe you have a separate grant specifically for the planning stage and permitting and A&E design, and then a future grant for actual construction implementation. So under 2, if none of these things can be modified, the next step would be OIA can look to adopt other agency CATEXs or establish new CATEXs from outside of DOI. So adoption is probably a year to 18 months based on recent trends. These require coordination outside of the department itself. So those timelines are outside of control by DOI. So if we need to take the approach of adopting another agency's CATEX, for instance, if you're going to Department of Agriculture and using one of their CATEXs, it may just require timelines that can't be controlled. And then if all else fails, there are still options to draft an EIA or EIS, but these are really handled on a case-by-case basis. So we would encourage you for these complex cases to talk to your grant manager early, because we typically are kind of moving towards easier pathways. And so those higher decisions are reviewed by OIA leadership. So I think that really sums up. I wanted to allow enough time for questions. I know this was a very brief overview, high-level overview, but I also just wanted to throw out there that we are available in concert with your OIA grant managers to help assist you if you have any questions or need help. So I'm going to stop sharing and just generally open it up. And so, okay, Tanya, is it back to your screen?
Right now it looks like it's just all of us, but what I wanted,
okay.
How about I go ahead and kick us off with a question?
Okay, great.
Can you repeat, I believe you mentioned it, but can you repeat what we do if there's a project that has many federal partners?
Yeah, so going back to the regulations, so that was that first link from the Department of Interior implementing procedures. So the final rule, there are actually procedures for how to delegate and choose which is the federal agency is the lead sponsor. And so the typical quick answer is usually it's the federal agency that contributes the most dollars. So for instance, if OIA is only funding 10% of the project and another agency is funding 90%, chances are that other agency is the lead agency, and we would be using their NEPA implementing regulations and guidance. And that's typically not handled by the grantee. That's typically a coordination between OIA and that other lead agency. They may or may not write an MOU. Sometimes it's handled just via email. And that once that agency completes their NEPA review, we would get a copy of their documents, review them independently, internally, and sign a memorandum if we accept those same NEPA conditions. Did that answer your question?
It did, and I have a follow-up question. Rhonda, I didn't realize, I thought it was more clear to me last week when we did the workshop, and I didn't quite get it, but I think I get it now. Each agency has different NEPA regulations because they have different responsibilities. So you mentioned DOI has many sort of land management, whereas the Department of Transportation might be more with road building. So
Correct.
that's
Yeah.
why you would want to go to another agency to adopt, because
Exactly.
maybe OIA
So
doesn't. Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
exactly. So if you're doing a residential development, housing and urban development, or HUD might have CATEXs and experience with these kinds of projects, and they may have a situation where they've done a routine small residential building, which is something Department of Interior doesn't typically do as a federal agency. So, we would lean on them with the expertise and then potentially adopt one of their CATEXs. And if we do adopt another agency's CATEXs, they also have sort of extraordinary circumstances we need to review. So we need to go through that whole process and just document the reasoning and why and how this CATEX might be applicable to this situation. So I hope I answered your question on that.
You absolutely did. I guess I just wanted to throw out that you mentioned a checklist, and you said that in an ideal world, what we're trying to build and help by sharing all this information is just to help grantees to be able to be more thoughtful about when they're submitting their proposals or requests for funding, to make sure that if there is going to be a larger environmental impact, to make sure that all that information is in there at the get-go, because sometimes that is the back and forth is what takes a long time when there's not clarity, right? So we want to help encourage or get to the point where grantees are providing complete information, because that'll just get things moving faster, grant funds going into the territories and the insular areas quicker.
Exactly. And so one more thing, if I can share one more page, I do want to encourage if things are very, confusing, I do want to try to demystify for people sort of this NEPA process. Again, I don't know, can you see my screen again?
Yes.
This is the DOI handbook. And so again, if you download it, Appendix 1 really talks about how NEPA works and how you use categorical exclusions. So that gives grantees a chance to feel like you have ownership of a project. It's, again, I don't want your grants to go into a black box and you feel like some other agency is reviewing it. We are here to work in concert with you. So if you have questions about, figuring out which laws and regulations or what is the process, please reach out. And I have provided my my link. I know Tanya can probably throw it into the chat. So if you need to reach out to me, but also reach out to your grant managers, because we're happy to work in concert with you.
I'm not seeing any more questions, but I do see Christina's reminder. If you have a question, don't hesitate to interrupt. I'm just going to read Christina's email, that reminder that the fiscal year is closing for us and our department closed, the system's closed down. So please get any final drawdowns to us in the next, okay, September 22 is the deadline, but don't wait until September 21, please. And to repeat, probably by the end of the week or within a week, we'll have this video and the other video that we mentioned. Rhonda also did another workshop last week in American Samoa, very comprehensive history and everything in there, a very deep dive. So that will give you another chance to take a look at NEPA more in depth, and we'll make sure that all of that is at this at our website page, OYA Monthly Workshops. Tammy, please go ahead.
I had written for a grant and we were able to secure it for the agency that I was formerly with, but it was for a river study and the NEPA actually happened after the fact. So I guess because being new to this process, I can actually reach out to Army Corps and request for the help to get this component going beforehand.
Yeah, so I'm not sure about that specific topic. I think we'd probably have to, and if you're comfortable, you can reach out and share the grant information. Maybe we have it on file and can look at just to get some more background. But yeah, typically we need to be doing the NEPA before. So again, things have changed a lot in the last several years, but following the current regulations and requirements now, we do need to complete the NEPA review before an ATP for a grant is issued and the funds can be used to proceed.
Okay, but when we're applying for the grant, then that would be conditional. We would receive a conditional award, I guess, and then the NEPA would have to, I guess, be
Yeah, so
commensurate.
so basically any time that you receive, let me share my screen again. So I'm going to go back to this NEPA compliance page. I don't know if you can see this. Let me go back one more. So in your terms and conditions, when anyone receives a grant, so any OIA grant, and your terms and conditions might look slightly different, very slightly based on the type of grant you receive, whether it's a CIP or EIC or a TAP grant. ATP is always required from OIA prior to the release of funds. So it says costs may not be incurred and work may not commence until the project OIA has issued an ATP. And it also states that prior to issuing the ATP, the grantee will prepare documentation necessary to comply with NEPA. So NEPA and is required prior to basically having an ATP issued. And so that's the case with any grant, regardless of when you received it or how you received it. And it isn't just OIA. I mean, every federal agency is required to comply with NEPA. So it is a federal law across every federal agency. But yeah, so that's always been the condition that before grant funding can be used, NEPA compliance needs to occur.
Rhonda, one point I've heard you make is that if you don't use federal funding, then the rules are different.
Correct. So there's no necessarily if there's no federal nexus or no jurisdiction, so it is the federal money that is the trigger for the requirement. But if an independent territory or a agency, or sorry, a local proponent is doing something and they might be using local funds that don't have a requirement, I can't speak to your local jurisdictions. So some local jurisdictions also have the requirement to get a land use permit and things like this, but that would just be a local jurisdiction. There's no federal requirement. NEPA is a federal law. So if there's no federal funding, there isn't a nexus to need that requirement.
Rhonda, I've put the pesticide use form in the link. I've dropped it in the chat if you wanted to just mention that briefly.
Absolutely. So we had talked about in some cases we need to comply with other laws. So Department of Interior requires that if we are using any sort of chemicals on a project, be those chemicals to control invasive species or pesticides, we need to have a chemical use plan. And so there's a form that we ask grantees to fill out. It's not a difficult form and it doesn't typically take much time, but OIA uses this to coordinate and get approval with National Park Service, referencing and off an EPA. So this is actually an EPA requirement to make sure that the EPA chemical use standards are followed. So again, a federal process, but not necessarily that difficult, but it's something that can happen quickly and concurrently. So as soon as you hear that you're approved for a grant, you can start preparing things like your local land use plan, applying for any local permits you might need, and preparing your chemical use plan. So I guess that would be my encouragement is don't, as soon as you hear from OIA that yes, you've been given a grant and you've received your terms and conditions, you can go ahead and start working on your NEPA process and getting all of those documents together. And then I think I also mentioned that checklist. I know Tanya and I have discussed this for American Samoa. Several of the CIP offices may do this, but when you first receive a grant, there is a checklist we ask you to fill out. Often it is just supplementary information because the kind of information we need for environmental compliance may not be the same as you filled out for your grant. So again, it will ask details about ground disturbance. If you can quantify, for instance, if you're trenching, let us know how large that trench is going to be or where it's going to be located. So those sort of specifics are what we need to coordinate, if any, with other federal agencies. And again, certainly if you think you're doing in-water work, you're removing vegetation or you're disturbing the ground, typically those sorts of actions require additional agency consultation.
Thank you, Rhonda. I've put that checklist. So when you're filling out your initial OIA applications for funding, you can, and if you believe you'll have a more complicated project, you can always take a look back at this checklist to sort of anticipate. There'll probably be more questions from our Army Corps team, and that's great. But this will give you a good head start.
Yeah, and it's designed to really help you think about and plan out these details when you're applying for the grant, so that you have a more comprehensive proposal from the very beginning.
Well, Rhonda, I think your presentation was excellent today. Thank you very much for pulling it together. We have our next grant managers meeting will be next, the last Tuesday of next month, which will be September 29. September 29, and the topics have shifted a little bit. So just anticipate that date, and we hope you'll find the future topic interesting as well. Rhonda, today's topic was super duper. Thank you for pulling together such a quick overview on a very complicated topic. And I learn every time that I take the presentation. So we'll encourage everybody to revisit the videos once we have them posted.
All
Christina,
right, thank you.
Thank you very much. Christina, do you have any additional? You've put in the date for drawdowns. Thank you for that. And thanks to any of our other grant managers on the line as well.
Nothing else for me. If you think you're going to be needing to file or request an extension, please do that now. Don't wait till one day before the fiscal year ends, please. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Yes, we're very glad to have everybody on the line. Thank you.